great. And then what makes a great speech?
Okay, so this is a very good question, right? It's a tricky question because there's so many things you could say go into that go into a good speech. But let me give you an example. May usually is the month of commencement addresses, and so we heard this year a lot of commencement speeches. I could one that comes to mind for me is the speech that Toni Morrison gave back in 2011 at Rutgers University. She gave a very similar speech a few years before that at Wellesley, but I think Rutgers for me is a good example because first it's a shorter speech, and usually a good speech is a short speech. And a good speech, even a great speech, has one idea at its heart, right? And when she spoke at Wellesley, she spoke about happiness. And she did, like 7 years ago, she spoke about happiness again. It was one of her favorite themes. And she told the students there that happiness wasn't good enough. They should not settle just for being happy. They should have a higher calling, and that they should write their own story. They were the writers of their own story. It's a powerful speech because it declines that very simple idea of happiness is not enough. And she gave many examples in that speech. And so for me, a speech is quite simple. It's hard to execute, but if you have one very good idea, that it's almost like the headline of an article or like a tweet. Think about it in terms of a tweet. If that could be your idea and then you find the examples, I think you're on the right path to write a good speech, even maybe a great speech. Then of course you had to add a lot of things to have a good speech: stories, tone. Like I said, it has to be rather short. All the great speeches for me are super short, from the Gettysburg Address to Greta Thunberg's speech that she gave at the UN. I think it's exactly like the Gettysburg Address. It's 400 words. I mean, not everyone can write a 400 speech and pack it up so much with powerful ideas. It's super hard. It's very difficult to do. But that's what you should aim to. Think on the short side. So those examples for me are great speeches. And I really encourage your listener to actually watch and read Toni Morrison's speech at Rutgers.
What is a typical day like for you?
Well, I would say that a typical day is quite boring for a speechwriter, right? You get to the office, you pretty much work alone most days. You have a lot of people you work with. I worked in very big organizations, so I worked with a lot of people. I work with a lot of people on a daily basis. But a typical day for me will start with reading. I never stop reading. Really, I would say the ratio, depending on the day, is like 60–70% reading and only 30% to 40% writing. And it happens at different time of the day, depending if you have meetings or and such. But I could give you one example where I thought it was going to be a typical day, but it ended up not being a typical day at all. The speech was written is when I worked for the US ambassador to France. And we had our speech, the prime minister was supposed to come. But the day before, there were revelations in the press that the NSA was spying on French citizens. And as you can imagine, the speech changed totally. In a matter of hours, we had to rewrite it. And so this is one of the things that speechwriters have to anticipate, is that even though the speech might be written and approved, and that takes a long time, by the way, we could go through different revisions and many people have to be involved. Even though that very speech is approved, you might have to go back and change it at the very last minute. And so I think this is what makes the job exciting. Because there's no typical day. You could be writing a blog, you could be writing a speech, you could be writing a video script, you could be involved with a campaign on social media, and there's many things.
Tell us about how is it that working, the social media impact on speech writing? What do you see happening in the last few years?
I would say that there are different steps. There were different cycles. When I started writing speeches, social media was quite, I'm quite old now. Social media was not very important, but I really saw the landscape change. And today, social media is very important. So when I write a speech, I make sure that that speech is going to be, I'm going to be able to use it and upcycle it and leverage it into different pieces that will be used on social media. So a few years back, it was not uncommon for me, for example, to turn a speech into an infographic. And I know many people today, no one cares about infographics anymore, but it was a good tool to make sure that the speech was well written. You could see all the different concepts and ideas being articulated like an infographic, visually speaking. Today, I think it's very important for me that my speeches could be used in blogs, and that we could reuse them quite quickly and fast and turn the speeches into blogs and other pieces. And I'm thinking also video scripts, because videos are very important. And a lot of people who give speeches now must be able to have videos that accompany their speeches, different products, not just the speech in itself, but different social media products that come with it. It's a whole package.
Yes, indeed, I've seen that happening more, that there will be the social media team that will have excerpts of the speech, and they will be live tweeting during the delivery of the speech. I've seen that happen in some events. So it is quite impressive the way, you can amplify the values, the messages of that speech in other platforms, in social media platforms. So what do you see the future of speech writing is?
It's a very good question, Maya. The future of speech writing, especially now in the times of COVID-19, is in flux. I mean, I'm part of a community of speechwriters, and we talk a lot about what's going to happen with speeches. And it's a legitimate question, because people kind of experience a statements fatigue at the moment. Every CEO or leader of an organization wants to go and needs to be out there. I mean, it's a prerequisite, right? I mean, take George Floyd's death, for example. If the people who didn't react fast enough were criticized. And I'm not to mention the people who did react, but were criticized as well, because their statements were either full of platitudes and generalities, and they were not very authentic. And so I would say in today, for me, I think the most important thing is to go back to the basics of what speech writing is. Not try to be overly creative with the use of technology, but to focus on what makes a speech good, which was your first question. And being authentic, being short, having really like the tone that is appropriate to the event. I mean, for me, all the best speeches in history were very appropriate, right? When RFK, when Robert Kennedy spoke to people, when there were riots, when Dr. King was assassinated. And that speech is still like a reference for speechwriters, because that night, after listening to Robert Kennedy, there were no riots in that town, right? And so it's a lesson on how speeches can be effective. Speeches can do and can change the world. And now I don't want to overestimate the impact of speeches, but I want to make that point. It's very important, I think, to remember that speeches can do that. And so I think looking into the future, I hope that speechwriters and other communicators go back to those basic rules and use stories and resonate with the audience, and don't try to follow a recipe. A speech is not necessarily, you go from A to Z. I mean, you do. It's a story, so obviously there's a beginning, a middle, and an ending, but you really need to go back to what makes a speech great, and I really encourage people to do that. And but at the same time, I said we should use technology and social media. I mean, they're here to help us. But the balance, you have to strike the right chord and find balance between these different tools.